Thanks everybody for being here. And the way we're going to do it, we're going to do it in 4 parts. I'm going to do the first part. Alex will take it after that, back to me, and then back to Alex at the end. And I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the national question and why it matters in the context of Canada. And I think sometimes we don't always take the time to kind of think through, you know, what are the implications of nationalism and different forms of nationalism. And so this is an opportunity to do that, especially in the context of Quebec, because as you've probably heard a couple of times today, we see Quebec, the Quebecois nation, as a nation that is oppressed under, Canadian capitalism. So just to start off with, and I'm going to set my timer, global imperialism, and probably we've heard a lot about imperialism, but I think it's fair to say global imperialism creates nationalism. And in fact, it's the only way to justify the military and judicial apparatus and the existence of borders. It is literally the only way that it can be done. This means pitting workers against each other, including the targeting of linguistic, cultural, and religious communities inside a nation state, especially those who are oppressed and who are seeking liberation. And that's in addition to all the standard tropes of targeting people based on racism, sexism, trans and homophobia, xenophobia, and all the other creative ways they pit us against each other. So just as capitalism generates imperialism, it also generates resistance, and often that resistance is in the form of national liberation struggles. And we've seen over, obviously in the last 2 centuries, in many incredible national liberations movements across the globe where they have successfully thrown off the shackles of their national oppressor in order to kind of recreate a state that presumably is going to be more liberatory. But very soon, almost in every single case, very, very soon, they find out the project of seizing the state and implementing in the interests of, the majority of people. Soon they find that they have very little actual power. And if any of you were here last night, I really liked Matthew Green's reference to, peeking behind the curtain, and it's just the Wizard of Oz there. And it's not as much power as you think, because every state is embedded into the international dynamics of capitalism, which creates certain constraints. So they're locked into a global capitalist economy. And so those states that emerge that are strapped for funds, that need support from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, find themselves basically at a power imbalance. And in order to get those funds, very often they come with strings attached, where they're supposed to end subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. And we can think of some of these institutions as well, the G7, the G10, all of these kind of advanced capitalist countries that really call the shots for any emerging nation states. But also, there's another dynamic as well that we want to understand around imperialism and nationalism, and that's understanding how the ruling classes of the world seek to retain their power. And I think thinking through the national question helps us think through how we can organize and educate to build international working class solidarity. But the other thing to be said about nationalism is that, by definition, nationalism tends to be a cross-class movement. In other words, it unites the ruling class of any oppressed nation with the working class. And so therein lies a very big contradiction, because generally speaking, without the leadership of class-conscious workers, the most likely outcome of a successful national liberation struggle is an independent capitalist state, and not necessarily a state that is designed not only to overthrow capitalism in that state, but to actually spread the revolution to other states, so that workers of the world can literally unite and exchange the goods and services they need based on use value and not on exchange value, which is where the capitalist class extracts its profit. So as long as any state is trapped in the global economic system, it will never be able to deliver the kind of liberation that most of the movements aspire to. It will merely replace the rulers of the former oppressed nation with new rulers drawn from the ranks of the capitalist class inside the oppressed nation. So Marx talked about the way in which capitalists are like hostile brothers. They compete amongst themselves, but they unite to impose their own class interests on the working class. But this division and competition means that the state does not concern itself with the well-being of the working class, but rather with the well-being of capital and its function, and within that, the well-being of different sections and interests of the ruling class or the corporate classes. So how can we build a workers' movement that can unite oppressor and oppressed workers in a common struggle that can achieve real liberation for all? And it seems like a contradiction because, of course, Marx said the ruling ideas of any epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. And workers in oppressed countries are very likely, workers in oppressor nations are very likely going to carry with them the prejudice and bigotry of their own ruling class. But the amazing thing is that when workers do enter into struggle together, they can very quickly shed their prejudice and unlearn the backward ideas that they have grown up with. But here's the problem. If we are not successful in winning workers in the oppressed nations over to a serious fight for the liberation of oppressed groups, then that bigotry of the working class in the oppressed nations will actually drive oppressed workers into the arms of their own ruling class. Because people, at the very least, seek understanding and aspiration. So it's very important that when we understand the national question, this is not about directing the workers of oppressed nations. It's about winning an argument against the bigotry that is very often held by workers in the oppressor nation. So let's remember, national liberation movements are by definition cross-class alliances. And the ruling classes, oppressed or otherwise, know that they too benefit when bigotry and chauvinism divide the working class. So the ruling classes in the oppressor and the oppressed nation each have an interest in cultivating that which divides us. Rulers in the oppressed nation will use every example of chauvinism to advance their own ruling class capitalist project. And we just think about Quebec, about how the Parti Québécois pretends that it's going to be offering, liberation for the Québécois, but very often it's imposing its own neoliberal agenda on workers. And we see this play out over and over again. Socialists in the oppressor nation don't necessarily call for workers in the oppressed nation to secede. Usually that's a step that we call for only when the depth of bigotry and chauvinism is so great that the idea is that workers in an oppressed nation has to separate in order to basically achieve equality with the oppressed workers in the other country. And so sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's necessary for people to withdraw in order to find their footing, get themselves from being under siege, and then to be able to resume the struggle. But it's not always the case. And the interesting thing in Canada is that there's many, many examples where despite the bigotry in English Canada, and I'll just, full disclosure, I was born in Alberta, and I grew up in British Columbia, and I am very well acquainted with anti-Quebec bigotry up close and personal. And it's hard for many people to think about it because the idea of oppression of other white people is a challenging thing. But I'll tell you something, during the constitutional debates around the Charlottetown Accord in the early 1990s, and there were massive protests led by the Reform Party, which was the forerunner to Stephen Harper and the Conservative Party in Canada, and so forth. Their edge of the wedge on that front was anti-Quebec chauvinism. And there were rallies at the Victoria Legislative Assembly where people brought with them, and I kid you not, Kermit the Frogs in nooses and shook them on the lawns of the Victoria Legislative Assembly. So that is a sight to behold. So the level of bigotry in English Canada is actually quite a remarkable thing. But even though that is really, really terrible, there have been lots of instances where workers unite, and I'm going to touch on them in a moment. One point before I get there, I do want to talk about the concept of unconditional support for the struggles of oppressed nations, but that doesn't mean uncritical support. But in other words, our support for national liberation struggles is not based on how that struggle is conducted by oppressed people or whether the timing is right for their struggles or whatever judgment we may have about that, our support is unconditional. But that does not mean that we cannot be critical. And by critical, we don't mean public denunciations of particular strategies and tactics in the context of a chauvinistic backlash. But what we mean by critical is that we want to be able to freely debate strategy and tactics with those struggling for national liberation to maximize the odds that workers will have access to the best strategies and tactics so that we can actually achieve the goal of winning liberation. But we cannot conduct these strategic conversations unless we have actually earned the right to do so. And in this context, I'm talking about the Anglo working class in Canada. Anyone who's not part of the oppressed nation has to earn the right to participate in these debates by being the best fighters against oppression of the oppressed masses. That means workers, and socialists in particular, have to lead by example, stand up to be the best fighters of oppression. And we have to respond to oppression no matter who is affected. We can't say, oh, that's fine if a member of the ruling class is subjected to a racist attack because they're part of the 1% and they're trying to impose cuts. We have to stand up against that bigotry and racism as well, because as soon as that is allowed to foster or fester and is cultivated, it weakens our movement. We have to stand up against every instance of oppression. So even, I'm laying all of this out because Alex is going to touch on a little bit more about the history in Canada, where workers in English Canada, sadly, despite many rich socialist traditions, have actually failed to break from their own illusions in the notion that the Canadian state is a progressive structure, a progressive entity. And instead of seeing their own liberation wrapped up in the liberation of the struggles in Quebec, they've seen Quebec as a threat to the coherence of the Canadian state. And if you believe the Canadian state is progressive and worth defending and worth celebrating, then it takes you down the road for workers to be taken, instead of down the path of solidarity, workers are taken down into the path of lining up with their own oppressors. And so even though socialists in English Canada admired the incredible working class struggles in Quebec during the 60s and 70s, their desire to preserve the Canadian state as a progressive bulwark against the bad U.S. imperialism meant that at every single critical moment, socialists in English Canada either hesitated or at worst failed the test to actually stand up and defend Quebec's right to self-determination. So I'm going to just pause there. I'm going to pass it back to Alex, and I'll come back in the next session.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. I think that touches on a whole bunch of what I'm about to talk about in a maybe slightly more applied way. And I know you all think this talk is about 1972, but first we're actually going to do 50 years of history in 10 minutes from 1917 to 1970. Now, of course, that's not possible to do it justice, but I want to talk about 5 key episodes that show how class struggle and the national struggle in Quebec have been intertwined, and were intertwined well before the 1960s, when that's often talked about. So those 5 episodes are the conscription crisis of World War I, the conscription crisis of World War II, the asbestos workers' strike in 1949, the Quiet Revolution, and the October crisis. And I'm going to do this all in 10 minutes, I promise. So World War I, as I'm sure you all know, Canada entered the war in 1914 in support of Britain. In fact, automatically at that time it did so. And in Quebec, it's important to say the leading nationalist figures also supported the war. At this time, these were figures in the traditional political parties, and they were pro-war. But popular sentiment in Quebec was not on side with that. And so the government called for volunteers. There were many volunteers in English Canada, but only 5% of volunteer soldiers were from French Canada, whether Quebec or elsewhere. Although at the time they made up 28% of the Canadian population. So there was a rejection of this war to support Britain as an imperialist power, and indeed France as well. There was no conscription for the first 3 years of the war, but in 1917 the federal government moved to impose conscription. And this triggered a federal election where the Liberal Party split into two wings. Former Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier led the anti-conscription part of the Liberal Party, and the rest of the Liberals united with the Conservatives in government. So it was a government versus opposition election. And so in Quebec, the opposition Laurier Liberals won 62 out of 65 seats. And in the rest of Canada, the government won 150 out of 170 seats. So you see this divide on a national basis between Quebec and the rest of Canada. And it has to be said, of those 20 seats that the government didn't win, many of them were in Francophone areas in New Brunswick and Ontario. And so there was mass sentiment in Quebec, including mass protests against conscription. And of course, it's interesting that Wilfrid Laurier is sort of the head of the opposition. Laurier was pro-war. Laurier, as prime minister, had sent troops to the Boer War in support of British Empire. So not an anti-imperialist, but was pushed from below into a position opposing conscription. This crisis comes up again in World War II. Canada enters in 1939 in support of the United Kingdom and other allies, and no conscription for several years. In 1942, the government holds a plebiscite to authorize conscription. And Mackenzie King thought he would win it everywhere. The result was basically exactly the same as the 19 federal election. 72% voted no in Quebec. And of course, Quebec is not entirely Francophone, so the Francophone no vote was even higher. And in the rest of Canada, more than 80% voted in favor. So again, you have this split. Now, conscription was actually delayed until 1944. The number of conscripts who fought was relatively limited in combat. So there was success in delaying conscription. That opposition did do something, although it did not ultimately completely prevent it in light of this overwhelming result from the rest of Canada. So again, in World War II, the view in Quebec was that this was a war in support of imperialist powers. And that's true, right? Britain was trying to keep its colonies all over the world. France was as well. Now, we may say World War II is more complicated and that there was also a fight against fascism, and that's an important part of the picture as well. But in Quebec, what predominated was the sentiment that this was an imperialist war, and that, you know, the working class was being asked to sacrifice, which is absolutely true in every single country in terms of who was dying in that war. So moving towards the end of that decade in the 1940s, there was a major strike in asbestos in 1949. And you probably all know asbestos because we've now spent decades trying to get it out of buildings, like probably this one. Don't push any of the ceiling tiles too much. But asbestos was this miracle thing because it was a great insulator and it could bond things, and so they put it in absolutely fucking everything for decades, which of course had deadly consequences. 85% of it was mined in this town of Asbestos, Quebec, supplying the world. So very important, not just to capitalism in Canada, but global capitalism. And it was American companies and English Canadian-owned companies that owned these mines, just like they owned virtually every major private business in Quebec. Majority Francophone workers working for Anglophone employers, and those companies ran their business in English. Which is quite shocking in many ways, because the Francophone population was not brand new, right? This had been going on for many, many hundreds of years that Quebec was a majority Francophone. And so this strike had many demands, union recognition, what we know as the RAND formula to pay dues to the union. It had wage demands, interestingly, occupational health and safety demands, because people would get silicosis from the asbestos. And of course, we now know all kinds of cancers as well. And so this strike polarized Quebec society. You had a right-wing nationalist government under a party called the Union Nationale that backed the employers, as it did in every single fight. But the Catholic Church, that had been the traditional ally of the employers and of the Union Nationale, split, with parts of the Catholic Church supporting the strikers, including the Archbishop of Montreal. And this was not a sign that the Catholic Church had necessarily had a come-to-Jesus moment, but it was a sign of shifting power underneath the surface of workers, and workers gaining more confidence to stand up to their employers, and majority Francophone workers standing up against their overwhelmingly American and English Canadian employers. The strike ultimately was largely ended in defeat. Unfortunately, they didn't get a whole lot, but it was a watershed moment, building the confidence of the class to fight in a very public way, uniting the labor movement in Quebec. It did fortunately get some support from labor in the rest of Canada. It got support from students, from intellectuals, from parts of Quebec society saying we're not prepared to tolerate these conditions anymore. And that strike is often seen as setting the stage for what's known as the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s, which was not a revolution in the sense of the Russian Revolution, of the whole system being overthrown, but a time of great social change. There was a challenge to the dominance of the Catholic Church, which until then had enormous amounts of influence in Quebec society. There was no Ministry of Education in Quebec until the 1960s because the Catholic Church directly ran education. There was a huge growth in the welfare state. There was a growth in national industries. So hydro was nationalized. You may know Hydro-Quebec to this day controls one of the largest hydro systems, the largest hydro system, I believe, in the world. There was a huge degree of social liberalization on things like sexuality, just like there was in other parts of the advanced capitalist world. And there were huge steps forward in French language rights, in saying that Francophones should be able to speak their language at work and in all parts of society. So the outcomes of the Quiet Revolution were a huge growth in the confidence of Quebec's Francophone majority in a range of different areas, in education, in terms of cultural advancement, in terms of things like sexual liberation. But what also arises during the Quiet Revolution is an attempt by a part of the Quebec ruling class to do what Pam was talking about and basically substitute itself for the existing ruling class. So instead of a British-owned company, we're going to have a Quebec-owned company, and there's going to be some Francophones in management. That was the program of the Quebec Liberal Party that was in power during the Quiet Revolution. Moving towards the end of that decade, you have the October Crisis, which I imagine most of you have probably heard of, but sort of very quick overview, a group called the Front de Libération du Québec, or the FLQ, kidnapped two people, a British diplomat, James Cross, and the Quebec Labour Minister, Pierre Laporte. And this sparked an enormous, and Laporte was killed, and this sparked an enormous backlash on the part of the governments of Canada and of Quebec. The federal government imposed the War Measures Act, and there were soldiers everywhere. But part of that is that they made the largest mass arrests in Canadian history, over 500 people, many of whom had nothing to do, the vast majority of whom had nothing to do with the FLQ. And so there was a big backlash in Quebec over that, over saying this was a huge government overreach, this was an attack on the independence movement in this response. At the same time, there was a recognition of the limitations of some of the adventurous tactics of the FLQ, which had been engaged in a series of bombings through the 1960s. It engaged in these kidnappings, but not at a revolutionary moment, not in a mass way of we're about to overthrow the government, in a kind of like, we're going to go do this thing, and did not have a lot of support among the population. And so there was a recognition of a need to shift struggle in a mass direction.
And to just draw on some of those things, like in terms of national oppression, when people have a kind of shared history, a shared language, and a shared experience of oppression, that tends to drive the kind of emergence of a national liberation struggle. And as Alex was saying, in terms of sketching out that history, it's important for us to know that that English was the official language of the workplace, and most corporate employers were English, despite a majority of people speaking French. And until the Quiet Revolution that Alex talked about, poverty was extremely widespread. And in fact, the socialist Benoit Renault basically describes it this way. He says, the French-Canadian working class was used as cheap labor, not unlike the Irish were used, until the 1970s. It was very common for French-speaking workers to have English employers and to function as in an English-speaking workplace, in spite of French speakers being the majority, both at the factory and in the town. Access to French language education was largely infused with religious training, as Alex explained, and French language education mostly prepared students for the manual workforce, while the English language curricula prepared English students to take their place in management and the governing structures of the English elite. And just think about the major universities in the province of Quebec. We think about McGill, formed in 1871. We think of Concordia, that used to be called Sir George Williams University, and that was named after an English philanthropist and businessman, founder of the YMCA. And that was founded, in the early part of the century in 1926. And then you had Bishop's University, which was also named after a guy, basically a bishop in the Anglican Church, named George Mountain. So the three major, marquee universities, post-secondary institutions, were all English only. So you can imagine that part of the Quiet Revolution was to actually fight for access to post-secondary education in the French language. And that helps to explain the emergence of the cégep system, the kind of community university network of people that bridge that gap. And so the fight today, generations and generations, those cégeps were free without tuition fees, and it was part of their national liberation struggle. So education, the access to education, is a very important part of the Quebec psyche. And it's why, you think about the big student strikes that have defended grants and opposed tuition fees and so forth. So fast forward to 1972. This is all very important context, and I'm just going to blow through what actually happened in 1972. So there was a formation of something called the Front Commune. So the CSN, FTQ, and CSQ, they're basically the three major Quebec trade union federations, basically got together and created a common front. And they had very important demands of things like $100 a week minimum wage, no matter where you lived in the province. Because again, there's arguments that, well, if you live in one place, you should be making less than somebody who lives in another part of the province. They demanded an 8% raise of all salaries to keep up with inflation that was higher at that time. They wanted greater worker influence in the corporate decision-making. They wanted equal pay for equal work, regardless of region or gender. And they did a kind of symbolic one-day strike in March of 1972. And basically the government, largely because they're Francophone workers, completely disregarded what their demands were. But there were, between April 11th and April 21st, there were 10 days that shook Canada, and actually that shook North America, because after a vote on April 11th, the Front Commune launched an indefinite general strike that encompassed hospitals, healthcare, schools, construction, hydro. Alex talked about how important that was. 9,000 workers from the Canadian Union of Public Employees also joined the strike, which was a newly created union, also emerging from the public sector unionization drive of the 1960s. And really up until that point, that was the largest general strike in the history of North America, which is incredible. 300,000 workers participated. Radio stations in 22 towns across the province were occupied, and their demands for social and economic justice were broadcast over the radio. Now, they didn't have access to social media the way we did today, so mail and radio were very, very, very important mechanisms for communications. And sadly, the strike ended when the government, surprise, surprise, passed legislation criminalizing the strike. And even though 60% of union members in a vote decided to keep striking despite the legislation, the leaders of the labor movement called it off. And so that was a very disappointing moment for the movement. But what was very interesting is that even though the top of the labor leadership called off the strikes, they were still under those leaders were still under huge pressure. And they were kind of forced to kind of pay lip service to the idea that, well, maybe the strike will resume if negotiations don't work and so forth. And then amazingly, even though those very leaders had called off the strike, just using that kind of language to say, well, maybe we should consider a strike in the future, they were arrested under the new law for incitement to strike. And like, what a heavy-handed move on the part of the state. So of course that provoked an absolutely furious response from the membership of the labor movement. And ironically, just at a moment when people were pissed at the labor movement, or at the labor leadership, I should say, this move by the state actually, brought people back into support of those trade union leaders. And the wildcat strikes erupted. So in Sept-Îles, for example, on May 10th, the day after those union leaders were arrested, almost the entire population of the town went on strike. Union members occupied the main thoroughfare, the main highway going through the city. They occupied again the local radio station. They seized control of the local airport. And that was a very important tactical decision, because that's how they would get the riot police. They would transport the riot police to come in, and that helped to prevent them from deploying them as quickly as they could. That working class population held it down for 10 days of a mass general strike. It is phenomenal. And also the flip side is the resistance to that, like the opposition from the ruling class. And a local Liberal Party organizer actually orchestrated what they called a vehicle ramming attack, where people literally ran their cars through the picket lines. 33 people were injured, and a 22-year-old metal worker was killed. So by May 15th, Liberal Premier Robert Bourassa announced that the Minister of Labour would meet with the 3 jailed union leaders with the goal of reopening negotiations, but warning that if tensions continued to mount, the government would take firm action to ensure the stability of our institutions. And then on May 25th, the union leaders were released. The 3 leaders were temporarily released from prison, specifically to be allowed to conduct the negotiations, if you can believe it. So that's a very short summary. That's a much more dramatic, nuanced history around the incredible struggle. But just to say, they didn't win all their demands right at that very moment, but it did put them into motion. So for example, the equivalency of a $100 minimum wage was won by 1974. Quebec, in 1979, Quebec's Common Front won 10 weeks of paid leave when parents adopted a child, and 5 days of paternity leave. And so it was the first province to actually implement maternity leave for workers. And the growing consciousness of economic and national oppression really began to solidify. And again, the tragedy of the English-Canadian labor movement not to seize on those opportunities to build solidarity and spread those strikes in the moment left workers in Quebec isolated. And when mass strikes fail and political actions fail to deliver wins, workers often shift to electoral strategies, which deliver disappointing results at best. And Alex is going to talk a little bit about the emergence of the Parti Québécois later on, and the Bloc Québécois. But it is a tragedy that the English-Canadian left failed the test, and that really is largely because of illusions that the Canadian state is a progressive entity rather than being the enforcer of capitalist relations. But despite the Anglo-chauvinism in the rest of Canada, over and over and over, there have been incredible moments where Francophone and Anglophone workers have fought together. The postal workers' strike in 1969 that actually gave birth to the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, workers walked off the job illegally, and Vancouver and Montreal workers timed it, not so that they were all walking out at midnight, but they took into consideration the time difference so that they were all walking out at the exact moment that they were taking strike action. In 1976, there was a general strike against wage and price controls. And again, Francophone and Anglophone workers fought together. In early 1981, the postal workers' strike was the first Canadian public sector union to win paid maternity leave. But it was inspired by the wins in Quebec, and their Quebec members participated. In 2003, the anti-war mobilization to stop Canada from officially participating in the Iraq War in many ways was led by Quebec, because the highest anti-war sentiment was there for the reasons that Alex explained. And to be completely honest, we can talk about this in discussion, but in 2011, even the Orange Wave, the big shift toward the NDP, I would argue with you, cannot be understood outside the context of Quebec workers trying to find a bridge to English Canada to stop the most reactionary parties from getting elected. I'll just end up by saying something that I think is important about what Alex said is that throwing off the shackles of the church was a very important class demand because the church had been in lockstep with the Anglo employers. And so it's one of the reasons why notions of secularism in Quebec carry particular weight, because people themselves have been through religious oppression and feel very strongly about the need for independence. And so because of that lived experience, we need to win those workers to a more nuanced understanding of how people exercise their right to freedom of religion, because the issue of secularism is being used to divide workers, and we can talk about more of that in discussion. But I wanted to just make sure we were clear on that nuance, because that's why there's sometimes a sense that Quebec is less tolerant of religious freedoms, but it's more about their own fear of being reverted back to a time when the church was an extremely oppressive mechanism in their society.
Yeah, thanks, Pam, for that excellent overview. So we're back at it. We're going to do 50 years of history in 10 minutes. Again, and I think 5 key episodes that really show the tension between left-wing nationalism in Quebec and bourgeois nationalism, really a fight over the soul of what the struggle is about. So those 5 episodes are the election of the Parti Québécois in 1976, the 2 independence referenda in 1980 and 1995, so that's 2, the Maple Spring student protests in 2012, and finally the 2023 Quebec Common Front strikes. So in 1976, the Parti Québécois wins power for the first time. It was a party that had grown out of the Quiet Revolution, had only run in a couple elections before that. Its origins are different than most social democratic parties like the NDP or the British Labour Party. It came out of the Quebec Liberal Party, basically. But it did have a broadly social democratic orientation. It had links to the labor movement. It was very different than the previous conservative Union Nationale government. And it brought in many important reforms that were often ahead of other provinces. Quebec was the first province to have anti-scab legislation in 1977, decades before any other jurisdiction in the country. And there were also important reforms with respect to the French language. Bill 101, that, as we've been talking about, required the language of the workplace to be French. And, you know, there was a really concrete reason for that, which is that it wasn't. It's not just a sort of symbolic thing. That was a real important reform for Quebec workers. But at the same time, the Parti Québécois took a neoliberal turn in the 1990s because it was always about integrating business and labor interests and subordinating labor to competitiveness concerns. So you sometimes talk about Quebec Inc., right? Quebec is going to compete with the world through competitive international companies like Bombardier and all this kind of stuff. And that, you know, is subject to the logic of capital, just like anywhere else. And so there was harsh austerity in the 1990s. There were attacks on union rights. This ultimately helped lead to a split in the party system, where in 2006, a new party called Quebec Solidaire was created that was explicitly a left-wing nationalist party. And so, you know, in my view, it was a welcome addition to the Quebec scene because it had an explicitly left-wing basis, where the Parti Québécois did not. Quebec Solidaire was founded on the principle of being a party of the ballot box and a party of the street. So a party with one foot in electoral politics and one foot in the social movements, which I think is a really good vision. I think probably it's fair to say that in recent years, more emphasis has been placed on the party of the ballot box. Its parliamentary strength has grown, and you kind of get sucked into the rhythm of electoral activity and maybe being a bit less front and center in social movements. There was also a split on the right, the Coalition Avenir Québec. The Premier of Quebec, François Legault, comes from that party. Speaking of airlines, he's the founder of Air Transat, a discount airline, so you can decide if that's who you want running your province. But that was a right-wing nationalist party. And federally, you have the Bloc Québécois, which has many of the same contradictions as the Parti Québécois, although, of course, it's never actually governed. So talking a little bit about the referenda, right? These are big events in Quebec politics and in Canadian politics. And And they both failed. The first one in 1980 failed about 60-40. The one in 1995 failed extremely narrowly, within 1%. So why do these referenda fail? I think the key reason is that there was a lack of clear social vision on the part of the Yes Committee about what would come next in the event of a win. What would change in society? I don't think there was a clear answer to that. There was a sense that there would be negotiations between the Quebec political elite and the Canadian political elite as to what the framework would look like, but not necessarily a particularly democratic vision. And I think this is underscored by Jacques Parizeau, the premier in 1995 was referred to as Monsieur, because he's, the little Monopoly character with the top hat. That's kind of what Jacques Parizeau was. Like, he was this rich, sort of outwardly very bourgeois-looking guy, almost a caricature. And so that's who was going to be leading the movement. And I think that led to a lack of confidence in the Yes side. Moving ahead a little bit, I think it's important that we focus on social movements because many social movements in Quebec have been more organizationally advanced than in the rest of Canada over the past few decades. And one of those movements has been the student movement. Pam alluded to there, this is one of many strikes that took place, but it's a very important one where the Liberal government, quite a right-wing Quebec Liberal Party, even to the right of the federal Liberals, tried to raise tuition fees in 2012, and students walked out en masse, 180,000 students, and they were joined by workers, by people in neighborhoods, right? Some of you may remember this. There were people banging les casseroles, right? They would be like, get kitchen utensils and be banging them from the balconies in Montreal as these protests walked past. So it was a really important moment of unity. And as Pam mentioned, defending the social democratic education model that was seen as a win for Quebec workers coming out of the Quiet Revolution, right? Access to the cégep, but also access to university is so crucial, where previously access to education had been very poor. And so tuition fees were linked to that. So both a national struggle and a class struggle. And labor struggles. So Quebec has had a stronger labor movement than the rest of Canada since the 1960s. About 40% of workers in Quebec are unionized versus under 30% in the rest of Canada. But strike rates in Quebec declined from the 1960s through to the 2020s, just like in other provinces. But fortunately, the labor movement is far from dead, and this was demonstrated recently by a new common front, which took inspiration explicitly from the strikes in 1972. 420,000 workers across Quebec lined up their contracts and went out at the same time. And that showed remarkable solidarity between unions that were often had rivalries, between workers in different sectors that often worked in quite different conditions, to come together over common demands. And they were successful in pushing the government to give a much better settlement than what it wanted to give, a significantly higher settlement on wages and on many other items. Now, there's some key differences with 1972. And the first is that the government reached a negotiated resolution and did not resort to harsh repressive tactics like it did in 1972, maybe because it learned something from 1972 about where that can go, and it learned something from 2012, these student protests. The government brought in an anti-protest law, which brought even more people into the streets. And finally, they were no doubt looking to the Ontario education workers struggle and what happened to Doug Ford. And so the government, seeing the unity of 420,000 workers, thought, well, okay, I think we can do something on wages here, and let's go that direction instead. And so that was great, right? That was a victory for the movement. That's what you want. But it meant that this second phase that Pam talked about, where there was sort of this movement from below without necessarily sanction of official trade union leaders, 2023 was not that. It was a strike that was under the leadership and direction of the official leadership of the trade unions. Had the government gone in that repressive direction, who knows where that might have gone, right? This was a real mass movement. But a settlement was reached, sort of in the conventional sense on the collective agreements, and that caused that particular moment to come to an end. So what conclusions do we draw from this? The first is that, class struggle is not dead, and progressive visions of nationalism are not dead. The starting point today builds on all the victories of previous struggles, of 1972, of the Maple Spring protests and of 2023, I'm sure is going to continue to inspire people for a long time and build workers' confidence and expectations. But also bourgeois nationalism is not dead. And we see now the Coalition Avenir Quebec government is pulling behind the Parti Québécois, which had been declared dead only a few years ago, and it's back. And so there's always going to be, under capitalism, versions of nationalism that prioritize a nationalism that does not challenge the prerogatives of capitalism. And in an international capitalist system, that means, as Valerie said in a talk I was in this morning, reformism without reforms, unfortunately. And so underscoring what Pam said, we as socialists have to support the right to the people of Quebec to self-determination without qualification, and we should stand in solidarity with everyone in Quebec as elsewhere who wants to transform their society into one that puts human need above private profit.